Here we are at the fourth session in our Preaching Christ from Old Testament Narratives series. This fourth session I'm calling How Old Testament Narratives Work. In my opinion, the most important principles for preaching Christ from Old Testament narratives are those that we've covered in our first three sessions together. We can sum them up as three. One, that what we must do when we preach from Old Testament is preach Christ. We must preach Christ, and we must preach Christ from the Old Testament. Second, the key to preaching Christ from the Old Testament is the gospel shape of the Bible, the description of which we often call biblical theology. And thirdly, that the gospel shape of the Bible, promise and fulfillment, means that the purpose, the promise of God revealed in any part of the Old Testament points to the fulfillment of God's promises in Jesus Christ. The question we must ask about any particular part of the Old Testament we are reading, studying or preaching on is, how is this text fulfilled in the person and the work of Jesus? Now in this session I hope to look at how Old Testament narratives work. We're getting down to the details. What is the meaning or the message of a narrative? If you want to go beyond treating the characters in the stories as examples of how to behave or not to behave, we looked at that in the first session, what should we be looking for in the narratives? If I've established the point in our first three sessions together that the narratives of the Old Testament point us to Jesus Christ, I now want to persuade you to slow down, to take time, to appreciate the Old Testament story before you, the one that you are studying, the one that you are reading, the one you are going to expound, to appreciate its depth and its profundity, so that when you move from this Old Testament text to Jesus, you really have learnt something from this text. In this session, I'm asking you to become interested, fascinated if you like, with the Old Testament narratives themselves, confident that time and effort you spend will pay generous dividends. And the question we are looking at, or at least starting with today, is simply, how do you study a story? How do you get beyond just hearing the story? How do you understand the meaning of the story? How do you get to the message of the story? We noticed in our second session that it's no accident that the Old Testament contains so many stories. And that's because the Old Testament as a whole is telling a story, the great story of God's purpose for his whole creation, how he chose to work that purpose out through the people of Israel, and we can safely assume that the narratives of the Old Testament, all being part of the big story, have a purpose much bigger than entertainment, bigger too than providing moral examples. Mind you, they are engaging stories, and moral examples are easy to find. Some of the best stories as stories in world literature are found, I believe, in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. But there's more to every story than that, and the more is more important. The question is, how do we discern the particular meaning or message, if you like, of a given narrative? What is it in a narrative that's significant? What do we focus on? How do we study a narrative? Well, as we turn our attention to the details of particular narratives, we must not lose sight of the basic principle that the key to discerning meaning is context. As we focus on a particular text, we must not lose sight of its immediate and larger context. One of the most important questions to ask of every Old Testament narrative is, how does this narrative relate to the bigger story of God's purpose that the Bible tells? One of the questions I ask is, how is this story related to God's promise that he made to Abraham? Because that's the promise, that promise is what kicks off the whole Old Testament story that then follows. However, while context is the key to understanding the meaning of the text doesn't come from the context, it comes from the text under consideration. And our question in this session is, how does a narrative convey its meaning? How does a narrative work? Narratives are different from other forms of communication. Those of us who love the New Testament epistles and their logical argument, the way in which the argument moves with logical connections and moves towards a conclusion with its becauses and its therefores, as well as the rhetoric of the New Testament epistles, we need to understand that a narrative works differently, but just as meaningfully. A narrative has 4 essential ingredients. Any narrative must have characters, it must have a place, it must have a time, and in addition, the characters, places and times must be put together to produce what we will call a plot. Characters, places, times, plot. These are the 4 essential ingredients that put together make up a narrative, a story. And I've found that giving attention to each of these elements, learning more about how they work and how they are working in a particular narrative, it's a little bit like learning how to study the logic of an argument by Paul in one of his epistles, how to notice the connecting words and that kind of thing. In a moment, I intend to begin to think with you about how each of these essential ingredients works and illustrate how valuable it is to pay attention to each of them. And we'll see how much we can do of this in the time available to us. As we observe the characters, the places, the times in a narrative, we'll notice that the narrative divides into sections. So certainly any narrative of any length can, in a fairly straightforward way, be divided into what I'll call scenes. The scenes of a narrative are a little bit like the paragraphs of an epistle. As the paragraphs represent stages in the argument and will be linked together in various ways, so the scenes of a narrative are stages in the unfolding of the story, and they're linked together in various ways. Recognising and following the scenes of a narrative is basic to understanding the narrative. For myself, I like to structure my sermon around the scenes and the unfolding scenes in the narrative. As we look at how the ingredients of a narrative work, we'll notice that some of the ways in which the scene changes are identified will come before us. For the expository preacher, as I say, the scenes often provide the structure of the sermon. Well, I'm going to look first at characters, then we're going to look at places, then we're going to look at times, and then we're going to look at the plot. Characters. What do we do with characters? Characters, of course, are very important to any narrative. It's hard to imagine having a narrative or a story without at least one character. But they are especially important to Old Testament narratives, as I hope we will see. I've just said all narratives have at least one character. Usually, of course, they have more than one character. And one basic task in studying a narrative is to identify the characters. Sometimes the first thing I will do with a narrative is to move through the text carefully and make a list of all the characters that appear in a particular story. It's usually helpful to divide the characters into major and minor characters. And this is usually quite clear. It's a simple exercise. If it's not all that simple, it doesn't matter which column you put it in. If it's a bit ambiguous, put them in the middle. But the major characters will usually be there at the beginning and at the end of the story. They'll often be at every stage in the story. The minor characters will be characters who just appear in the background. Perhaps they're just mentioned and they don't actually do anything in the story, or they play just some minor role like that. A really minor character is one who's just mentioned in the text in passing. So-and-so, who's the character in the story, might be the son of somebody else. They're mentioned, but they don't play a role in the story. But I make a list of all the characters so that I make sure I'm aware of who is in this story. Now let me illustrate the value of attention to characters with the terrible story of Amnon and Tamar in 2 Samuel chapter 13. The story is one of the most horrendous in the whole Bible. But the major characters, and we'll just focus on the major ones, the major characters are David, his 2 sons, Absalom and Amnon, and David's daughter, Tamar. Now, they're all mentioned in the first verse of 2 Samuel 13. There are some minor characters. There's a nephew of David, Jonadab, he's mentioned in verse 3. There are some unnamed people who are present in Amnon's house in the middle of the story in verse 9, one of whom, a young servant, appears briefly late in the story in verse 17. There's a really minor character, Shimeah, David's brother, who's mentioned in verse 3 but doesn't appear in the rest of the narrative. Now you see what I'm doing? I'm just making a list of the characters. I'm putting them out in front of me. That doesn't take me very far. Just noting the characters doesn't tell us very much. What do we do with the characters? Well, the first thing is that the comings and the goings of an important way in which scenes or divisions of a narrative are marked. So, in 2 Samuel 13, I notice scene 1 is verses 1 and 2, which involves just Amnon and his lustful thoughts. In scene 2, Amnon meets his crafty cousin Jonadab. That takes us through verses 3 through to 5. In scene 3, Amnon is on his own again. This is verse 6, but his father visits him. Scene 4 is David sending a message to Tamar. That's verse 7. Scene 5 brings us to the heart of the story as Tamar comes to Amnon's house. This scene is rather long in the telling. It runs from verse 8, where Tamar comes to the house, and verse 17, where Amnon throws her out. Scene 6 is Tamar alone with her grief. That's verses 18 and 19. Scene 7, she's joined by her brother Absalom, verse 20. Scene 8, David hears what has happened, verse 21. And the final scene, scene 9, verse 22, we look back to Absalom and his seething hatred, and we're prepared for the next episode. That's the story in 2 Samuel 13, verses 1 down to 22. You notice what is happening here is that the comings and goings of the characters show us the structure of the story, and observing those things helps us to see how the story is in fact structured. As a matter of practicality in preparing a sermon, I may well decide that 9 scenes is rather too many parts to have on Sunday morning in the sermon, even apart from thinking that this is a rather difficult story to preach on Sunday morning. I may group some of the scenes together. However, the central scene, the long one, which I've now identified, will be central to my exposition. And I'd be inclined to expound this narrative probably in 3 parts. I'd take scenes 1 to 4, then the big scene 5, and then scenes 6 to 9. The next important step with characters is to make sure you know who they are. The most important thing is to take careful note of characters who come into the story with a prior history in the larger story. You see, it's a way of seeing the story in context. Now, the most obvious, in the case of 2 Samuel 13, of course, is David. Every reader knows who David is and knows David quite well by the time we reach 2 Samuel chapter 13. In particular, 2 Samuel 13, when we get to that story, we might think that David is a minor character, but he's so important in the context. Before 2 Samuel 13 and after 2 Samuel 13, it's always difficult to think of David as a minor character. David was the king of Israel. And David was not just any king, he was God's chosen king over his own people, Israel. His story started way back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, and it's been a remarkable story. The high point was just a few chapters earlier, when the astonishing promise had been made to this king by God: "Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." 2 Samuel 7, verse 16. The low point of David's story came a little bit earlier in chapter 11, where David proved himself to be an adulterer and a murderer. At this point in the story of 1 and 2 Samuel, we've been somewhat disillusioned by David, but he's one of the characters in 2 Samuel 13. The second character to note carefully, and this is the kind of thinking that I'm doing at my desk on Monday morning as I begin my preparation, and I've identified the characters. I'm trying to work out who they are. The second character to note carefully is Amnon. He is David's eldest son. We learn that from 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 2. When we meet Amnon, we cannot help remembering the promise in chapter 7, verse 12, God's word to David, "When your days are fulfilled, you will lie down with your fathers, and I will raise up your offspring after you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom." Amnon was then the most likely candidate to inherit David's throne, this throne that God had promised he would establish forever. Third, we also meet another son of David, Absalom. Absalom was apparently the second oldest surviving son of David. An older brother seems to have died. I won't go into those details. So Absalom is the second in line for the throne. Amnon and Absalom were both David's sons but had different mothers. They were half-brothers, you see. We learned that from earlier in the narrative. The fourth character to mention and to work out who she is Tamar. She was David's daughter and Absalom's sister. She was therefore, of course, Amnon's half-sister. This is a complicated family if ever there was one. The minor character, Jonadab, who appears only in verse 5, was David's nephew, and therefore Amnon and Absalom's cousin. He's described in the story as a friend of Amnon. Now, in the terrible story that 2 Samuel 13 tells, it's absolutely crucial to understand who these characters are. You don't get the story unless you get who these characters are. The chapter tells one of the most sordid stories in the whole Bible. It's Amnon's heartless and violent rape of Tamar. It's even more deeply shocking than the David and Bathsheba and Uriah story in chapter 11, I think, at least in the way in which it's told. And there is much in that story in 2 Samuel 13 that just cries out for a moral application. And such application is not wrong. Indeed, I don't know how you could avoid making such application. But it's not adequate. Indeed, it's terribly inadequate. For you see, the main point of this story does not lie in its moral lessons. I don't want to avoid the moral lessons. I don't want to say we can't use the moral lessons. Of course the moral lessons need to be heard. They are vivid and powerful. But when we see who these characters are, the astonishing thing is the jarring dissonance between the promises of God a few chapters earlier in chapter 7 and the performance of David and his sons. When you see Amnon having seen David, and then you see Absalom, and you see Absalom in the next episode, can you believe that a son of David will ever do anything right, let alone establish the kingdom of God? What were those words in 2 Samuel 7 again? "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom." Notice how we are reminded in verse 1 that Absalom was David's son. We're reminded that Amnon was David's son. If Amnon and Absalom are the sons of David, again we ask, what hope is there for the promised kingdom ever to come? Centuries later, that question was still being asked, or a question very like it. You see, as Jesus began to make an impression on the crowds around him, you know one of the questions they asked? They said, it's in Matthew chapter 12, verse 23, they said, "Can this be the son of David? Could this be the one who Amnon plainly wasn't, and Absalom failed to be, and all the rest failed?" You see, despite the performance of David's sons and his sons' sons and their sons, and generation after generation, the failure of the kings of Israel, the descendants of David, generation after generation, the reality failed to match the promise. What the promise stood. The God who made that promise never backed away from it. Never was he unfaithful to his promise. And those who continued for centuries later, to believe the promise that God had made to David, when they saw Jesus, said, "Could this be the son of David?" And of course the answer that the New Testament gospel gives is yes, it is. The point I'm wanting to underline here is how attention to who the characters are leads us into the significance of the story. Now in the Bible narratives, there are three special characters we should always consider carefully. Let me say a few words about these three rather distinctive characters. The first is the narrator. The narrator is not strictly speaking a character, unless of course he's telling the story in the first person. There are some stories like that in the Bible. But the narrator is nevertheless very important in every narrative, the person telling the story. In Old Testament narratives, the narrator is almost always anonymous. We don't know who wrote most of the stories. We don't know who's telling us the story. But he is, however, a person who we should be listening to most carefully. It's not our job to make our own assessments of the characters and the incidents. We should be listening for what the narrator is telling us. A faithful expositor is the expositor who presents the viewpoint of the narrator. Now, this is not always simple. There is often great subtlety in the narrator's presentation. He may give clues and hints rather than explicit statements. But the point is that what I think of Saul, or what I think of Jonathan or Samuel or any of the other characters, is really irrelevant to a faithful exposition of the stories. I need to understand and convey what the narrator thinks. Now, listening to the narrator sorts out some difficulties in the narratives. For example, the narrator tells us in the last chapter of 1 Samuel 31, I think it's verse 4, that Saul committed suicide. When you turn the page to 2 Samuel chapter 1, you find that an Amalekite comes to David and tells David that he killed Saul. Do we have a contradiction here? No. It's perfectly clear that the Amalekite was lying. That's what the narrator is telling us. The narrator has told us already how Saul died. When the Amalekite comes with a different story, a contradictory story, the narrator's version of events always has authority over any of the characters in the story. More subtly, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the narrator tells us in the first few verses of that chapter that Samuel became old, poor man, and that his sons did not walk in his ways. They were corrupt rogues. They were just like Eli's sons earlier. But then in verses 4 and 5, the elders of Israel came to Samuel, and you know what they say? We've read that bit by the narrator. Then the elders of Israel come and they say, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways." Whatever else we might think about the next thing that the elders said to Samuel, the narrator has made sure that we know that they were right. They were right about the problem. Now, in the narratives in 1 and 2 Samuel, occasionally the narrator gives us information about God's involvement in the course of events. Now, such comments are gold nuggets. I like to underline them when I come across them in the text to make sure that they're given full weight. Things like 1 Samuel 1:19, when the narrator says, "The Lord remembered Hannah." That's why Samuel was born, the narrator has told us. No one else in the story could really tell you that with authority, but the narrator can. In chapter 2, verse 17, he tells us that the sin of Eli's sons was very great in the sight of the Lord. Their behaviour was that serious, the narrator has told us that, so we know that it's true. Very terribly, in chapter 2, verse 25, he comments that it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. See, I like to underline anything that the narrator tells us like that. The narrator's voice is the authoritative voice in any narrative. You don't have to necessarily believe any of the characters, but you must believe the narrator. So he's one of the special characters that I take special note of what he has to say. The second special character, if I can speak reverently like this, is God himself. God is involved in all biblical narratives, even if he's not mentioned. The big story, of which the individual stories are part, has shown us that God is the main character of the big story. These stories, all of them, are about our God and his purposes. His purposes for his people Israel, but also his purposes for the whole of his creation. Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2 verses 1 to 10 functions, as I've said earlier, as a kind of overture to the whole of the 1 and 2 Samuel story. And it should alert us to the fact that the most important character in the narratives that follow is the God of whom Hannah speaks so magnificently there in chapter 2, where she says there is none like him, where she says that the God of knowledge, he is the one by whom actions are weighed. He is the one who will judge all the earth. He is the one who will give strength to his king, and so on. God's most obvious and explicit appearance in the narratives of 1 and 2 Samuel is by his words. These are conveyed by prophets or by priests or by some other unspecified means. It's a reasonable assumption that the narrator and God have the same point of view. The narrator presents the words of God as the ultimately authoritative voice in the story. Take very careful note of God's words in any narrative. Again, I'll underline them with some special colour so that I don't miss them. However, the narrator and God are the only infallible voices in the narrative. It's possible for even Samuel to blunder, and he does. It's possible for any of the characters to speak wrong things, to tell lies, to do wrong actions. If you want, the voices that we trust as we read the narratives are the voice of the narrator, and of course when he quotes for us or gives us the words of God. The third special character that I just want to mention as we're filling in about characters, the third special character worth mentioning is the people. They're special for rather different reasons from the narrator and God. They're very often in the background to the main action, but almost always the people are affected by the course of events that's being played out by the more prominent characters. The simple point I want to make is that it is appropriate for us to, if it is appropriate for us to identify with any of the characters in the narratives, more often than not, we should identify not with the heroes, but with the people. Now, this is very important, for example, in a story like the one we looked at earlier on, David and Goliath, in 1 Samuel 17. Most people who read the story of David and Goliath want to identify with David. They want to recognise that they're really unimpressive little people who nonetheless, through bravery and courage and trust in God, will conquer their enemies. We want to identify with David. We want to encourage people to identify with David and see in him a great example of faith in God, overcoming great enemies by the power of God. But that really isn't the way the story is presented. David is God's king, defeating the enemy for God's people. And they rejoice in David's victory, but they didn't win it. We are much, much more like the people than we are like David. And the gospel dimensions of the narrative often become clear when we see the story from the point of view of the people. When we see the story from the point of view of seeing a king that God has provided, who has won a victory for us that we didn't play any part in, you can begin to see the gospel dimensions of this story. So what I'm saying is that giving careful attention to where the people fit in the narrative will often save us from inappropriate moralising. One final comment on the characters, and then we must get on to the other elements in the story. Have you noticed how biblical narratives do not tend to major on what we might call characterisation? It's true that several characters in the book of Samuel are vivid and lifelike. From their words and their actions, we do get an impression of the personality of the main figures. However, I would suggest that this is not the main interest of these narratives. They're not presenting character studies. Our conclusions about character and qualities and strengths and weaknesses are generally incidental rather than central to the stories. I don't want to overstate this point. However, the biblical narratives are very different from a Charles Dickens novel. The most important thing about the characters in biblical narratives is who they are in relation to the purposes of God. David was the man after God's own heart. I said earlier on, not in the sense that he was a particularly godly man, but in the sense that he was the man on whom God set his heart to be king for him. David must always be seen in that light. The biggest puzzle about Saul is not whether or not he was good, or whether or not his repentance after his disobedience was sincere, or what his motives were when he disobeyed God and so on. Those are valid enough questions, but they're not the really important questions. And we mightn't be able to answer those questions. The important question is, where does Saul fit in God's purposes? That's the key question. Character studies of biblical narratives may have their place, but they must make great care not to miss the main point of all biblical narratives, which has to do not just with the human characters, but with the purpose of God, which was given in the promise to Abraham and would eventually be fulfilled in Jesus. Okay, we've had a little bit of a look at characters and their importance. Let's say something about place and how that matters. The second essential element in a narrative is place. All narratives take place somewhere, and often in more than one place. So a second basic task in studying a narrative that I now want to look at is to identify the place or the places in the particular narrative. And again, I'll make a list. If places are mentioned by name, I'll make a list of the places that are mentioned by name. If we move from place to place in the narrative, I'll try and make a note of that. I'll list the places. Where are we? Geographically speaking, where are we in this narrative? Place contributes to the narrative again at two levels. One, in many stories, the location is a very important part of the story because the place itself is significant. This is certainly the case with many Old Testament narratives. I'll come back to that in a moment. But secondly, in addition, within any story, movement from place to place is often how the story is structured. I want to look at those two things briefly. Firstly, significant places. It's common, of course, for places to be named. And when a place is named in a narrative, the reader is assumed to know this place. Modern readers usually need the help of a Bible atlas, and I would always try and have a Bible atlas open as I'm reading these narratives to know where the various places are and where they are in relation to one another. Although sometimes we have to admit that these days we now no longer know the name, the location of a particular named place. However, the naming of a place very often indicates not just the location of the place, but something of its significance. And I always want to ask, where have I heard of this place before, earlier in the Bible story? And so I find that a concordance or some other kind of Bible search is at least as important as the atlas when it comes to place names. Because I want to find out, where did I hear about Shiloh before? What has happened earlier at Shiloh? What connotations does Shiloh have? You see, some places have a major significance in the big story, of which the particular story is just a part. And just as with the characters, it's important to take note of places that have appeared earlier in that bigger story. Sometimes their later significance, by the narrator's time, really is important. One of the most astonishing things I came across in 1 Samuel chapter 17, that story of David and Goliath again, is how significant it is that Jerusalem gets mentioned in the David and Goliath story. I'll say more about that a bit later on. But Jerusalem really hasn't featured in the story prior to this, but by the time the narrator is telling this story, Jerusalem is very significant, and he mentions it in the David and Goliath story. Let's come back to that a little later on if we have time. A couple of other examples. 1 Samuel begins with Elkanah and his family making their annual visit to Shiloh. Now, Shiloh was the place where Joshua had set up the tabernacle in Joshua 18 verse 1. I discover that by looking at my concordance. It was the location for a great assembly of the people at the time of the distribution of the land, again in Joshua 18 and 19 and 21. We know from Judges 21 verse 19 that there was an annual feast of the Lord at Shiloh. Shiloh again features in the story of chapters 1 to 4 of 1 Samuel, and is then hardly heard of again in the whole of the Old Testament. It was probably destroyed in the dreadful defeat of the Israelites by the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 4. But in 1 Samuel 1, where Shiloh appears, we should be aware that Shiloh was the national centre. It was, in a sense, the capital city. What happened at Shiloh may well turn out to be of national significance, as indeed it does. Another example, 1 Samuel 11, verse 14. Samuel summoned the people to Gilgal to renew the kingdom. We won't go in now into what that precisely means, but Gilgal was given its name because it was the place where the people under Joshua first came into the promised land, and there they were circumcised, and the Lord said, "Today I have rolled away," this was the play on the word Gilgal, "today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." What a significant place to summon an assembly, especially an assembly that's going to be called to remember all that the Lord has done for them. When they come to Gilgal, they cannot help but be reminded of what has happened earlier at Gilgal, and so we as readers should be reminded as well. A third rather telling example for us just to notice is that I doubt that any reader of 1 and 2 Samuel who knows the story and knows where the story will eventually lead will fail to notice the significance of Bethlehem. If you know what happened at Bethlehem so many years later, then you cannot help but prick up your ears when you see the things that happened at Bethlehem. And Bethlehem appears at a number of places in the 1 Samuel story. What I'm saying is look out for places. Look out for places that are significant and their significance in the greater story. Places do not necessarily have the weighty significance of Shiloh and Gilgal and Bethlehem and Jerusalem. However, they may be significant in the immediate story. Now here I think that I'll pass over some of our material here that I've got here in order to fit everything into our time, but it is worth noticing that when a place is mentioned, if it's been mentioned before in the immediate story, then it may be significant. There are battles that take place in 1 Samuel that take place at a place that a previous battle had taken place. So what are your expectations? That kind of thing. Place plays a role in narratives at another level, within the particular story itself. Very often a story involves movement from place to place. Now again, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but if you had a look at 1 Samuel chapter 1, you would see that the structure of the story is about the family that comes down from Ramah to Shiloh each year, and they go back and forth, and the whole story is structured around the movement back and forth. So noticing the movement helps you to notice the structure of the story. Now a whole lot of other observations could be given about this second ingredient in the narrative, place. But I think I've drawn attention to enough to indicate their value. Characters, place. The third fundamental element is a little bit more tricky, but it's also essential. Time, and how time changes. So just as all narratives happen somewhere, and all narratives involve some character or characters, they also take place at some time. And to follow a story carefully, you must notice the time. Like place, time contributes to a narrative at two levels. There's the question of when the sequence of events took place, and then there's the matter of the movement through time that takes place in the story itself. Let us, as briefly as we can, look at how time works in those two ways. First, when a particular story took place. That's really a way of asking about the context. If we consider the long narrative of 1 and 2 Samuel as a whole, we've noted previously that the story is set after those 200 years or so covered in the book of Judges, and before the stories of the established monarchy and its collapse in 1 and 2 Kings. We are given no indication of the passage of time from the end of Judges to the beginning of 1 Samuel. This suggests to me that the narrator doesn't want us to envisage any particular passage of time. 1 Samuel therefore appears to begin in the days referred to at the very end of Judges. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's interesting to notice that explicit indications of time are not very common in the narrative of the books of Samuel. However, with a qualification that I'll make in a moment, it's important to understand that the significance of each episode is influenced by when it occurred, what precedes and what follows. Again, I keep coming back to 1 Samuel 17 because it's so valuable to illustrate these points, but we cannot read about David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17 without remembering that sometime earlier in chapter 16, David was identified as God's choice to be Israel's king. We cannot read of God's choice of David in chapter 16 without remembering that God's rejection of Saul happened sometime earlier in chapter 15. We cannot read of God's rejection of Saul in chapter 15 without remembering that this is the second time that this happened, because it happened earlier in chapter 13. And we can't read of the first rejection of Saul in chapter 13 without remembering the terms and the conditions of the kingship that had been laid out so carefully and so clearly by Samuel in chapter 12, and so on. In other words, the temporal sequence of events is very important for understanding any particular story. That's the first level at which time works as a feature of a narrative, the context of the narrative in time. The second level, however, is the movement through time that takes place in the narrative itself, in the story itself. To follow a narrative properly, we need to appreciate how time is passing. Now, of course, a story can take place in a very short space of time or over many, many years. Furthermore, the short space of time can be narrated in a very long story, while many years can be passed over in a few words. Indeed, within the one story, time usually passes at different speeds. Time can stand still as a narrator indulges in a long description of something, and then time can fly by, as in 1 Samuel 7 verse 2, where 20 years pass over in a fraction of a sentence. The clues given by the narrator can be quite subtle. Again, let's have a look, because it's becoming familiar to us, at 1 Samuel chapter 1. We're introduced to Elkanah and his family in the first 2 verses of 1 Samuel 1, and then the narrative as such is put on hold while we're informed about an annual custom of this family. So the story doesn't really start in verse 3. In verse 3 you're told about what he used to do year after year after year. And you follow that custom of how they went every year, they went to Shiloh, and they did it every year, year after year after year, and how it was a miserable experience every year for Hannah. And then it seems to me it's in verse 8 that the sequence of events that makes up the narrative of chapter 1 actually begins, with something Elkanah said on one particular occasion. In verse 19, which takes us to the next day, they go back to Ramah, time passes, Samuel is conceived, he's born, he's named, all in one sentence in verse 20. In verse 21, we come to the time for the annual trip to Shiloh again. It looks as though a year has passed from verse 19 to verse 21. In verse 24, we may guess that about 3 or 4 years have passed, and the boy Samuel is taken up to Shiloh to serve there. Let's just keep going for a moment. Through 1 Samuel 2, we have an account of what was going on at Shiloh as Samuel was growing up. So time is passing, and we're hearing about the kind of things that were happening. Then in chapter 3, my guess is that another 10 years or so have passed by the look of the apparent age of Samuel at this stage. By the time we reach 1 Samuel 4 verse 1, Samuel seems to be an adult. Between 4:1a and 4:1b, an unknown period of time passes, possibly it was years, and then the events of chapters 4 to 6 have taken place over a period of about 7 months, we're told in 6 verse 1. Then in 7 verse 2, we're just following how time is moving. In 7 verse 2, 20 years are passed over in a phrase, so that when you get to 8 verse 1, we're told that Samuel is an old man. Now, all I'm saying here is that following the story involves following how time passes and being aware of the passage of time, fast and slow. The passage of time, like movements from place to place, often indicates the structure of the story. If you carefully observe all the indications of how time is passing in a narrative, you're very likely to find important indications of the divisions of the story into scenes, as we saw later on. A new day is almost always a new scene. However, I want to talk to you briefly about one of the cleverest things that the Bible writers do, in my opinion, in the way in which they tell the story, and it's got to do with time and how they play round with time. Of course, biblical narratives, and especially Old Testament narratives, if you haven't got this already, you haven't read enough of them, they are extremely clever. I'm inclined to say they're extremely sophisticated as pieces of literature, and they're particularly sophisticated in the way in which they use time in telling the story. Of course, for a story to be comprehensible, there is a general framework where the story moves forward in time. At different speeds, as we've seen, but nevertheless you move forward most of the time in the story. The end of the story is almost always something that occurred after the beginning of the story, a pretty strange story otherwise. However, within that framework, Old Testament narratives seem to display a remarkable creativity and freedom with what we might call flashbacks, or sometimes flashes forward. For reasons of dramatic effect, or in order to display a close relationship between two events that are actually separated in time, the narrator often distorts the flow of time and brings the events together, or something like that. And sometimes it's quite spectacular. Let me show you the most astonishing example I've been able to find. Again, it's in the David and Goliath story in 1 Samuel 17. You remember David had killed the giant. But then we read, and I wonder if you've ever noticed this, in verse 54 of 1 Samuel 17, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but put his armour in his tent. That's weird. The killing of Goliath, you see, took place a long, long time before David got to Jerusalem. Indeed, Jerusalem's not mentioned again in the story until the day in 2 Samuel 5, years later, when David, as the king, took Jerusalem to be his royal city. But at this point in the story of David and Goliath, in 1 Samuel 17, the narrator drops in a spectacular flash forward in time to tell us that when David eventually got to Jerusalem, you know what he did? He took the head of Goliath with him. And so he connects the story of the defeat of Goliath with David eventually coming to Jerusalem with Goliath's head. It's as though he's saying this is where David's journey to Jerusalem, to Israel's throne, began. Now, this way of telling a story, of distorting time for dramatic effect, is not at all unusual in Old Testament narratives. If you're a reader of historical critical commentaries, and I'm not at all... I don't at all mind if you're not, but if you're a reader of historical critical commentaries, you'll notice this feature is almost always misunderstood by the scholars. Whenever we find that a narrator has presented something out of chronological sequence, it's always worth asking why. And usually there's a very good reason, and it's got to do with the drama of the story and something he wants us to appreciate. You see, I'm pretty sure, let me just give you one more little example of this. I'm pretty sure that David coming to Saul's court as a minstrel, which is at the end of 1 Samuel 16, actually happened after the David and Goliath episode in chapter 17. But the narrator wants us to understand the connection between David's anointing in Bethlehem and the Spirit of the Lord rushing on David from that day forward, and Saul's distress when the Spirit of the Lord had departed from him. And so those two incidents are brought together. I won't take you into any more detail on that. Rather less common, but nonetheless equally clever, if I can describe the Bible writers like this, is the presentation of events as contemporaneous. Sometimes the narrator seems to want us to understand that while one thing was happening in one location, something else was happening at the same time in another place. Now, he didn't have the modern business of a split screen on the television or anything like that, but the best example that I've seen of this is again in 1 Samuel. We haven't time to go into the details at this stage, but in the last 2 chapters of 1 Samuel, the narrator tells us about David's activities in the south, saving his people from the Amalekites in chapter 30, at the same time as 100 miles north, Saul was facing his final hour and the Israelites were fleeing before the Philistines. And I do think we're meant to see those 2 incidents and to appreciate that they were going on at the same time. One king was dying, one king was saving his people. And if you had the technology, you'd put it on a split screen and watch them going on at the same time. What we're saying at this point is that careful attention to the third ingredient that makes up a narrative, time, will always help us to see how the story works. Let us spend a little bit of time on the fourth and the last element that makes up a story. Characters, places, times are the 3 essential ingredients to all narratives, but that doesn't mean that if you just had a list of characters and a list of places and a list of times, that you'd have a story. These 3 things need to be woven together to form what I'm calling a plot. A plot comes into being through the actions and the interactions of the characters, the places, and the times. A simple narrative can have just one plot, just as a very simple narrative could have one character, one place, and a very short time. More complex narratives have several plots that are interwoven. We find both simple and complex narratives in the Old Testament. And at the risk of oversimplification, let me describe what a plot is. A plot itself has 3 parts, typically: a problem at the beginning of the story, a resolution of the problem at the end, and a turning point somewhere in the middle. The plot is the movement from the problem to the turning point and then to the resolution. In the simplest narratives with just one plot, the problem and the resolution will correspond fairly closely with the beginning and the end of the narrative. In more complex stories, several problems may be introduced in the course of the narrative, some of them more important than others, each with its own turning point and each with its own resolution. As you study a story, try and work out the plot. Try and work out the problem or the problems. Try and work out how that problem is resolved or partially resolved by the time you get to the end of the story. Try and work out what is the turning point that enables the resolution to be reached. Let me give you some examples. The problem is generally some difficulty or some tension. It's a situation that gives rise to the story. Now let me pick it up in a number of the episodes in 1 Samuel. Right at the beginning, 1 Samuel 1, Hannah had no children. That's the problem that gives rise to the story that runs through 1 Samuel 1. You get to chapter 2, Eli's sons were corrupt wretches. We learn about them in chapter 2, verse 12. That problem, they were the priests and they were exploiting the people. That problem gives rise to a story that will run through to chapter 4. In chapter 3, the word of the Lord was rare. In chapter 3, verse 1. That problem gives rise to the story that runs through to the end of chapter 3, when the word of the Lord comes by the prophet Samuel. A fourth example, we're looking at problems, right? Problems that give rise to stories. The Philistines defeated the Israelites in chapter 4, verse 2. That problem gives rise to the story that will run right through to chapter 7. In chapter 4, verse 11, a dreadful thing happens. The Philistines captured the ark. And this problem gives rise to the story that runs through to chapter 6. Or again, the elders of Israel, in chapter 8, verse 5, asked Samuel for a king like all the nations. That problem gives rise to the story that runs through, I think, the rest of 1 and 2 Samuel. Now, with those problems, let me just show you where the resolutions come. I'll go through the same narratives. Each of these cases, the problem has been introduced into the narrative, and at least part of the sequence of the narrative is working towards the resolution of the problem. And so, in chapter 1, Samuel is born. In chapter 1, verse 20, Hannah's childlessness is resolved. Chapter 4, verse 11, Eli's rotten sons, that problem that we saw at the beginning of chapter 2, is resolved by their death in chapter 4, verse 11. The word of the Lord came to all Israel by Samuel in chapter 4, verse 1, thus resolving the problem of the word of the Lord being rare at the beginning of chapter 3. The Israelites defeated the Philistines in chapter 7, verse 11, dealing with the problem that had been raised earlier. The Philistines returned the ark to Israel in chapter 6, verse 12. Israel got the king that they asked for in chapter 10, verse 24, but is that really the resolution? What I'm saying is you're starting to get how the stories are working by recognising the problem and the resolution. And the line of events from the problem to the resolution is the plot. And I encourage you to practice tracing the plots of Old Testament narratives. And along the plot line there is usually a turning point where the resolution begins to emerge. Carefully observing the plot or the plots in a narrative is not as simple as simply listing the characters or looking up the places in an atlas or even following the movement of time. However, it is just as important in the careful study of a narrative. Unless you've got the plot, you haven't, of course, understood the story. Now, I have mentioned that Old Testament stories are often very complex. They often involve more than one plot. There can be plots within plots. There can be overlapping plots. This certainly happens in the stories in 1 and 2 Samuel. And unravelling the plots so you understand what's going on can take some time and some thought and some reflection. But that's the hard work that we do in studying these narratives. It really is time for us to conclude. When I was preparing this material, I did consider taking all my time exploring the kind of things that I've touched on in this last session. There is a great deal more to say about studying narratives and how they work. It's become, in fact, a rather trendy area of studies in biblical studies. There are major books written about how narratives work. One of the classics is by Robert Alter, that's A-L-T-E-R, The Art of Biblical Narrative. There is another one by Fockelman called Reading Biblical Narrative. They're excellent volumes and I'm very happy to recommend them, though I certainly don't recommend everything that they say in them, but in terms of gaining tools for understanding how narratives work, there's lots of material out there to look at. However, I decided to only give one talk on this subject, not because I think it's unimportant, but because I think it's the icing on the cake. I do find that insights from the study of narrative techniques in the Bible and how narratives work is very useful, and they translate aspects of preaching from these narratives. It will always be the case that preaching will be better when the more attention is given to the details of the text. But the fact is that the most sophisticated of the writers on Old Testament narratives, like Alter and Fockelman, fail completely, in my opinion, because they do not expound the narratives in the gospel context of the Bible. The icing of narrative art is no substitute for the cake of biblical theology.